You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Become a subscriber and support Radical Radio. Call 03 9419 8377 or subscribe online at 3cr.org.au/subscribe.
Minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name is Joseph Toscano. It's streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast if you miss segments or if you want to re-listen to the program. And if you live in Victoria, it's a rebroadcast, believe it or not, at 5 a.m. on a Friday morning. So, anarchism. What's it all about? What's it all about, Charlie? Simple concept means without rulers. Not without rules, without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people these days? Inequalities in power and wealth. Something we are seeing accelerate in the last few decades. Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve or share power, possibly through direct democratic means, not through representation, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Simple concepts, difficult philosophy, ideology, whatever you like to call it, to implement. Because obviously those who hold power, those who have wealth, will do anything, as we see constantly through human history and as we see in the 21st century, to hold on to that power and wealth, but more importantly for them, to expand their power and wealth. Now, sometimes you have to laugh. You have to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Now, it's interesting, in the last 24 hours, we've seen a Congo line of people, the powerful, the wealthy, the disjointed, kissing the buffoon's ring. All right? Kissing the buffoon's ring. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the land, not of the brave and the free, but the land of the cowed and the bonded. Here we have the people of the USA have elected a buffoon, a billionaire buffoon, to resolve their issues. So, but what's more extraordinary is the fact that we have people from around the world, including this country, lining up to kiss the buffoon's ring. Extraordinary sights. Now, the world has gone through many phases, and we've seen many buffoons come and go. But unfortunately, buffoons can cause a lot of damage. A lot of people think that democracy is the rule of the majority. And if you get the majority of votes, then you can do what you like. irrespective of the constitutional arrangements within a particular place. And if you don't like the constitution, you change it to suit you. So what we are seeing is the concentration of power in an individual and a society which prides itself on being a bastion of freedom and free enterprise, inverted commas, falling over themselves to kiss the buffoon's ring because it may somehow make them great again. Now, there is nothing new regarding these grandiose ideas. There is nothing new in leaders or rulers thinking they're infallible, that somehow they have the solutions to all the world's problems. Now, obviously, over the next few weeks, especially in Australia, which is very USA-centric, we will be bombarded with the decisions which have been made by the buffoon. That's right. We'll be bombarded by the decisions. And little old Australia, irrespective of who it's led, is lining up to kowtow to the buffoon's wishes. As I said before, is democracy about majority rule? Do we burn witches? Were we going to burn witches? Are we going to castrate people because we don't want them to breed? If that's what the majority wants, is that what we should support? Because democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people, and that's the key, for the people, is not about majority rule. We've seen societies, including our own here in Australia, where the majority have been involved and supported atrocities and legislative atrocities which have made life exceptionally difficult for sections of the population for decades. Or you've got to look at the way we have interacted with First Nations people, the way we've interacted with migrants, especially migrants who weren't Anglo-Saxon orientated. I mean, we have we've seen extraordinary periods of human history. Buffoons have been in charge of instruments of power which have a profound impact on those around them. So does it make it right if the majority wants to expel millions of people? Is it right if the majority believes that minorities should have no rights? Is it right that people who've been involved in activities against the state are pardoned willy-nilly? You know, the buffoon says it's right. The buffoon says he and he alone has an agenda. And while Americans, and let's not forget, Americans did vote for the buffoon and his policies, and let's not forget that America has a very, very checkered history in terms of the way, as we have, dealt with minorities, not only dealt with minorities, but dealt with the majority of the population. So this is not a period of despair. It's basically a comedy skit when you think about it. Buffoon throwing pens into the crowds, adoring crowds, jumping up and down, as executive orders are passed, not legislation, but executive orders. So the greater the concentration of power in individual hands, whether it's a president or a non-elected dictator, the greater the concentration of power, the greater the damage that can be caused, especially to groups which don't conform to the image that a majority thinks they should conform to. Ultimately, America's love affair, or the United States' love affair, with the buffoon is their problem. It's our problem too, in many ways, because of our close relationships with the US of A. The fact that we have multiple foreign bases on Australian soil, the fact that we've supported every United States intervention around the world, the fact that our military digital industrial complex is totally interwoven with the United States military project, the fact that not all power lies in the hands of the president, the buffoon, who's president of the United States of America. So for us to line up to kiss his ring because he's the president, and somehow the policies which he is enacting, which he promised he would enact, let's give them the man, his measure, the promises he would enact, which a majority support, somehow has anything to do with freedom or democracy or even economic prosperity, is a matter for debate. So, my concern is the fact that we as a country are going to be dragged down the same path. America first means Australia second. It's very simple. And if you look at the history of the United States of America, they're one of the great superpowers that cuts and runs. Afghanistan, Vietnam, you name it. When the pressure gets too much, they desert their allies and disappear into the ether. And for us to hitch our wagon to the back of their wagon is a very dangerous game. See, when you talk about a sovereign nation state, what we should be talking about is that nation's state ability to make decisions to benefit the people they represent. Now, to give the buffoon and his friends in the conga line who are waiting to kiss his ring his due, present, to give him his dues, the fact is that Americans think this is the way forward for them. They think allowing billionaires to control government somehow means that more crumbs will be brushed off the corporate table. Now, life is a sum game, as I say. 1 + 1 = 2. So the more resources that go into the hands of a shrinking minority, the greater the pressure on the rest of society to survive, let alone prosper. And if the buffoon thinks that their economic policies are somehow going to help America, not the United States of America, but America become great again, let's see what happens. This is nothing more than a tawdry soap opera. Nothing more. And the fact that Americans have gone down this path, and Australians are toying with the idea of going down this path, highlights the type of world we have become. And on every available indicator, we are seeing the concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer and fewer hands. And the day of reckoning will come. It may not come tomorrow, but a day of reckoning will come. When you have 8 billion people living on a planet with limited resources, facing a climate emergency because of the way we live, when we're not actually willing to acknowledge that such an emergency exists, and the Buffoon is putting in place legislation which will stop any efforts to change that, you begin to understand the reality. And let's not forget, the Buffoon is the father of 1 million dead. While the rest of the world took precautions regarding COVID-19, Americans lost 1 million people. 1 million people due to COVID. And a significant number should not have died if elementary precautions had been introduced. And to think that the previous Buffoon had to pardon the man who was in charge of implementing policies to trying to save Americans from themselves because he may be prosecuted, highlights the situation they find themselves in. But my problem is we may find ourselves in a similar situation. Now, it's very easy to criticise, you know. It's easy for me to pontificate and criticise. It's easy. So what are we on about? What are we on about here in this country, in this so-called sovereign nation state? What are the things I'm interested in? There's a federal election coming up in the next few months. And obviously people are talking about giving money to this and giving money to that and doing this and doing that. So what am I interested in? What are we interested in at the Anarchist World this week? What are we interested in? You know? 1, a universal basic income. Now, if anybody thinks there will be no job losses through the implementation of artificial intelligence, think again. A universal basic income is the antidote to the jobs lost through the implementation of artificial intelligence. Every person in this country should be able to access the basic necessities of life because they exist. Not because of what side of the sheets they were born on, not because of what side of the railway tracks they were born on, not because of the job they may or may not do or the education they have, but the fact they exist. And the implementation of the digital age will mean that not every person in this country will have the opportunity to participate in the job market because they will no longer be needed. So a universal basic income is something that I'm very interested in for the forthcoming federal election. What else am I interested in? I am sick and tired of seeing the rich grow richer. The billionaires in this country, yes, we don't talk about millionaires anymore. We're talking about people with 1,000 million billionaires, earned on average $67,000, not a year, not a month, not a week, not a day, but every hour. Their wealth increased by $67,000 $5,000 every hour. And that concentration of wealth makes them too big to fail, and it allows them to apply legislative pressure. And that's why the Pratts and the Reinhardts of the world have joined the conga line to kiss the buffoon's ring. So I'm interested in two new taxes, yes. Not taxes which are levied against workers, not taxes like the goods and services tax, which have a profound impact on those who earn the least or those on social security benefits, but a 1% financial tax on transactions over $5,000. Why do we have a goods and services tax but not a financial transaction tax? And a 1% stock market turnover tax every time a share is bought or sold. Now, these are minuscule taxes in terms of the profits which have been accumulated by the mob that earns, and their hangers-oners that earn $67,000 an hour. And money raised through this taxation revenue can be used to finance the universal basic income and bolster revenue for public health, public education, the NDIS, public housing and public infrastructure. Yes, I use the P word, public. The next thing I'm interested in, as far as this federal election is concerned, is to drastically reduce defence ties with the failing empire, the USA, and strengthen defence ties with Australia's Asian neighbours. We don't live on the east coast of America. You can't attach tugboats to Australia, and drag it to the east coast of America. The fact is, this is where we live. This is our part of the world. These are our neighbours. These are the people that we should be talking to, irrespective of the governments they have. These are our neighbours. And to continue to increase defence, so-called defence ties with the failing empire is ludicrous. Because how many people do you want to be sacrificed? How many Australians do you want to be sacrificed to support the United States foreign agenda policy? Now, we're told it's about America first. And it's all about internal changes, but it's not. It's about the 880 US bases which are spread around the world, including Australia. So drastically reducing ties, military ties to the USA should be an important initiative. It's not, but it should be. We're all talking about all the way with the buffoon and his motley crew, not what are we going to do to ensure we put Australia's interests first. And I know the referendum failed. There were sections of the First Nations people who were against the referendum, but the fact is, the failure of the referendum has given the Liberal National Party, especially the National Party, the springboard it needs or needed to get back as government. Everything that Mr Dutton is saying, the alternative Prime Minister is saying, regarding First Nations people, is about going back pre-1967, when the federal government had no power to legislate in terms of the interests of First Nations people. So isn't it time that we've rebooted the failing reconciliation process by beginning negotiations with this country's First Nations people, you think it'd be the decent thing to do. You would think. That's something I'm interested in. How do we restart that process? Now, I don't know how you feel about this, but I am sick and tired of being told there is no money. That's right. There is no money for public education. There is no money for public health. There is no money for this and there is no money for that. Okay? When I see and have seen and continue to see corporations extract resources from this country's earth, export them to the rest of the world, and the government of the day receiving a peppercorn return in terms of 2% of this country's jobs and in terms of taxation revenue. I mean, we jump up and down when taxation revenue regarding the mineral sector goes up a little bit because we're exporting more iron ore or uranium. But the fact is that the majority of the profits which derive from the exploitation of this country's resources go to the corporations and their shareholders, not to the people of this country. So I would like to raise the question of nationalising without compensation. That's right, nationalising without compensations all mineral resource corporations, both foreign-owned and locally owned, with an annual turnover over $100 million. Why shouldn't the benefits of this country's wealth be shared by all Australians, not just shareholders? Doesn't make sense, does it? We have some of the most atrocious situations among First Nations people living side by side by these mineral resources where people are making extraordinary profits and little, if any, even when agreements are made, are forced upon local people, to assist the situation they find themselves in. Let's move on. Now, something I'm interested in is expanding. You like that word? Expanding the Australian economy. Now, we have two sectors in this country. One is about 90% and one is about 10%. We have the private sector and the public sector. And during the last half century, during the deregulation, corporatisation, globalisation, privatisation mania that has swept the country, we have seen the rise and rise and rise of the private sector, not only in terms of profits going to a shrinking minority, but in terms of the lack of competition in almost all segments of the Australian economy, because the economy in every aspect is dominated by a few players in each sector. But the trouble is, if you want to grow a third tier to the Australian economy, there is no way you would obtain seeding funding. I'm talking about collectives and cooperatives forming a third tier of the Australian economy. You have the private sector, the public sector, and you have a cooperative and collective centre. Nobody grows rich in a cooperative or collective, but people are able to produce products or services that are useful to the rest of the population and receive a reasonable return for their work. The trouble is getting seeding funding. So I'm proposing to use 1% of Australia's superannuation contributions to provide seeding funding for cooperatives and collectives, to create a third tier to the Australian economy to increase competition. That's right, me talking about increasing competition. Because there is no competition. Look at the financial sector, food distribution sector, mineral sector. It goes on and on. Dominated by a few large corporations. Look at the new platforms, the digital platforms. They see something growing that may be a threat in the future to their financial profitability. They buy it up, close it down. No wonder everybody's living in a information silo. No wonder we are seeing such divisions created in our society, divisions which are based on nothing more than a divide and rule mentality, where people who've been ostracised or marginalised somehow think it's the other. It's the other in our community that is profiting and they're losing out. But the fact is, on every available indicator, wealth trickles upwards. It doesn't trickle upward, it defies gravity. It is a torrent going away from the majority. We should be, considering our limited population and our extraordinary natural resources, we should be paradise on earth. We shouldn't have private charities trying to raise money to send Australian kids to public schools, or to raise money to ensure that research continues in various health areas, and the list goes on and on. There are over 35,000 charities registered in this country doing jobs which should be done by the government of the day. And last but not least, something I'm also interested in is creating a new public bank. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember the Commonwealth Bank, see, the Commonwealth Bank, it wasn't not only to create a profit which went back to the Treasury, and that's what people forget, is that many nationalised industries created profits which went back to the Treasury. But having a publicly owned bank in the financial sector acted as a brake on the fees and charges and the influence that the privately owned banks had on development in this country. So it's time to create a new public bank. But this time, unlike all the public facilities we have in this country, but this time its ownership should be incorporated in the Australian Constitution. Now, it doesn't matter whether these policies come to fruition or not. What matters is they go out into the public realm. Now, obviously, a minuscule minority of people listen to the Anarchist World this week. But the fact is, there will be a federal election looming. I think people should think about whether they want to stand or not. And it is an expensive undertaking, a federal election. But the fact is, this is one of the few times in Australian society where alternative or different ideas, they're not alternative, they're different ideas, can actually be put up for debate. Because I'm sick and tired of going through the same rigmarole at every election where it's reduced to a contest between two leaders for the future direction of this country, when there are no real differences in policies. Let's move on. have you thought about the cost of a day out at the Australian Tennis Open? You know, here we have people bashing a ball across the net. Now, I'm sure many of these people who are bashing a ball over a net are very, very talented people. Yeah, and if you do well, you can make a bit of money out of it. But have you ever wondered what the cost of a day out at the Australian Tennis Open in Melbourne is? Because as I speak, we're getting to what they describe as the pointy end of the Tennis Open when we get the finals, right? And I'm not talking about the cost in terms monetary costs, but the personal cost that everybody who attends the tennis pays. Because there is a personal cost which most people aren't aware of. Now, obviously, when you buy a ticket, you hand over some cash, or these days, a digital exchange, all right? But that's not the issue. The thing is, the more you pay, the better the seating. That's the way these things work. You give them your name, you give them your email, you give them your telephone number, and you may even give them your address, all right? But there is a little extra people are giving this year. They're giving permission for facial recognition. Technology to be applied to their little face. So you go in, you go to the tennis, you watch these finely honed athletes bash a ball across the net, and you go, ooh, ah, isn't that spectacular? Ooh, ah, my hero has won, or my heroine is winning. Ooh, ah, isn't it exciting? But the cost is far more than financial. Facial recognition technology is part of the Australian Tennis Open, and we shrug our shoulders. The fact is, this is something which is yours. It's an essential component of your existence. And you're giving this away to a corporation which can on-sell this, if they wish, plus your other data, to some other organisation. So it's not just authoritarian governments like the Chinese government, which is using facial recognition technology, but it's now become part and parcel of everyday existence, even when you want to waste your money seeing some people bash a ball over a net. The cost is that you agree to your features being put in an algorithm and to be used for all eternity, not just by this institution, but possibly in the future, the information that is being obtained can be off-sold to another institution. Think about it. Think about it. This is new technology which is being used to control people. Not only that, I understand that if you go and get a drink, you got to pay, and if you don't pay, they'll chase you because they know what your face looks like or how it's extraordinary. The cost of a day out at the Australian Tennis Open. Next, maybe they'll want your soul, but who knows whether we have a soul or not. Let's move on. I just want to look at this majority rules garbage again. Does the majority rule? If the majority wants to burn witches, do we burn witches? If the majority wants to have public executions, is it all right to have public executions? If the majority, as we saw at the beginning of the 20th century in this country, wants to expel Kanak indentured labourers in their tens of thousands, Did we support that? If the majority refuses to acknowledge the prior occupation of this continent, do I have to go along with that lie? Really? Does majority rule? Think about it. There are elements to life which go beyond what a majority wants. And that's what a constitutional arrangement is about. Constitutions should be about protecting the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power, irrespective of that individual's religion or political leanings or the colour of their eyes or the fact you think they're a witch. It's not about majority rules, because majorities can be whipped up to support the most barbarous acts, and we've seen it over and over and over again, where the other becomes, the objects of our hatred. And 20 years later, they're our greatest trading partner. How ridiculous. Have you noticed the difference about how the Australian media portrays the Gaza carnage? Now, I can't bring myself to saying war, but the Gaza carnage. Have you noticed the difference? Have you noticed the difference? Well, I have, but unfortunately a lot of people don't. We've seen 47,000 people and about 3,000 in Lebanon and maybe over 1,000 in the West Bank die. And we saw 1,200 people die in Israel on the 7th of October as a result of what's happening. But the Australian media somehow relays the messages of war criminals, and these are war criminals for which a arrest warrant has been issued, as the words of gods, as truth incarnate. It's just extraordinary. When a war criminal tells the government of this day that it should do this and it shouldn't do that, and it shouldn't support a ceasefire, the Australian media jumps behind the war criminal. I mean, what we've seen in Gaza and the Middle East in the last 15 months is just as horrendous, if not more horrendous, with what's happening in the Ukraine. But in that particular dispute, the Russians are the evil ones. Putin's a war criminal, which arrest warrant has been issued. And the Ukrainians can do no wrong. Well, as far as the Middle Eastern conflict is concerned between Israel and the Palestinians, the war criminals can't do no wrong. It's extraordinary. Extraordinary, as in one case, we accept Putin is a war criminal. The International Criminal Court has said he's a war criminal. And there's been an arrest warrant issued for his arrest. On the other hand, we have the Prime Minister and the former, Defence Minister or Foreign Minister of Israel have been designated to be war criminals and arrest warrants have been issued. But as far as we're concerned, they're the good guys. Extraordinary hypocrisy. Just extraordinary. You really have to think what country you're living in, What's reality? But the thing is, the great thing about the 21st century, as we've seen with the election of the Buffoon, is the fact is that reality doesn't matter. Facts don't matter. Nothing matters. All that matters is the reality you're able to create in people's minds. A reality which you can manipulate, push around, create. It's almost as good as the Middle Ages. Let's move on. Ultra-processed foods. I'm sure you've heard of the word ultra-processed foods. Well, they're actually not foods. Now, we all talk about gambling and the harm that gambling does, and I've got no issues with that. Obviously, there are people, about 40% of gamblers, especially with poker machines, who've got an addiction. They lose everything at the end of the day. It's a fact. And we know that smoking causes lung cancer, although some people continue to smoke and it's addictive. And we know that many of the drugs you can buy on a street corner or get delivered to your house may have, may make you feel better initially, but, in the long run can become addictive. We know that. But when it comes to food, we think, food? Well, how can food be a problem? How can food be a problem? Now, it's easy for me to actually be an expert on this issue because I've got a little bit of a weight problem, all right? And so have about 60% of my fellow Australians. And so have an increasing number of children. So I'm speaking from personal experience. And when you live in a society where ultra-processed foods are so easily available, you've got to be over 18 to walk into a pokie venue. You've got to be, over 16 to get a cigarette, or is it 18? When you look at alcohol, it's the same story. But when it comes to ultra-processed foods, we are allowing the corporate food manufacturers to get away with murder. That's right. Because the problems associated, the healthcare problems which are associated with obesity, especially obesity which is caused by consumption of ultra-processed foods, has become a national emergency. And I don't use that word lightly, a national emergency, as far as children are concerned, as far as young adults are concerned, as far as older people are concerned. And if you like to look at 19th century cartoons, the rich and powerful were obese and the workers were skinny for one very good reason. They didn't get a lot of food. Today it's the opposite. If you've got the disposable income, you can join a gym, get a personal trainer, eat a diet which is appropriate. But if your income is limited, you're forced to buy for yourself and your children what's easily available and cheap. And that's ultra-processed foods, especially snacks. Ultra-processed foods. So we now have the ridiculous situation. I know you're all familiar with infant formulas, but we now have the ridiculous situations where you have toddler formulas. You go into a shop or a supermarket or a pharmacy and you buy toddler formula. And toddlers love toddler formula because it's full of sugar. But there is nothing good about it. It's all ultra-processed foods. And most soft drinks you buy, ultra-processed. And if you try to do the right thing and drink something that's got no sugar in it, and you read the label, you'd be shocked by the amount of additives which are added to ultra-processed foods. So why do we have this avalanche, tsunami of ultra-processed food? And why are we seeing the privatisation of breakfast, lunch and tea? What I mean by that is the fact that cooking has become an optional extra. Although there are cooking shows, a plethora of cooking shows, it's all about the quick, the takeaway, the ultra-processed food. And ultimately, this is causing more damage to more individuals, to the fabric of this country, than gambling, smoking, and illegal drug taking combined. And the fact is that, like all other aspects of our existence, ultra-processed food production is dominated by a handful of corporations. And they have so much power that we find governments incapable or unwilling to actually challenge what they are doing to people. If the job of a government is to protect its citizens, not just from foreign invasion, but from exposure to damaging aspects, the fact is that most state and federal governments have failed miserably in the job of protecting us as a community and as individuals and our children from the dangers of ultra-processed food. So, think about it. Eat fresh when you can, if you can afford it, and you can. When you go to the supermarket or your local fruit and vegetable shop, the shrinking fruit and vegetable shop, the numbers shrinking, look for seasonal food. That's the cheapest you'll get, and that's the healthiest. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. You can write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can email me at anarchistage@yahoo.com or info@pibci.net. YouTube channels, josephtoscano.nam, public interest before corporate interest. That's public interest before corporate interest. You can join public interest before corporate interest online. Go to pibci.net. You can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. And you can also leave unpleasant messages, 0439 395 489. Hopefully, you're getting yourself involved in things. The key is involvement. We can all be digital warriors. We can all clap at the end of a great event. But ultimately, change comes from your participation. Don't continue to be a member of the Gunner tribe. I'm going to do that, or I'm going to do that, or the somebody should do something about that tribe. Ultimately, change comes from people taking action. Don't despair. It's a time of great opportunity. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. And if you see anybody kissing the buffoon's ring, tell them it's dangerous. they can catch diseases. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. And if you can't sleep and you live in Victoria, the program is broadcast at 5 a.m. again on a Friday morning. And I do know that some people do that. I don't know why they do it. They could listen, they could podcast it. Go to 3cr.org.au.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
.3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.